please feel free to contact me. My phone number, my email address there. I'll introduce some of my other EGLE colleagues. Here I've got Tiffany Johnson, who's the principal engineer for the site, who's worked on it. Gary Shireen is the district supervisor for the site. Dave Willard is our enforcement coordinator for the site, and then I don't see Jill Greenberg is our spokesperson for EGLE, media spokesperson. So my intent here is to give an update about what some current developments at the site, some recent accomplishments, and what still has to be done, and the status of what's being done in the groundwater investigation, remedial investigation. So Bob did give a pretty decent background of the history of the site from a process standpoint. I'm going to give a background of the site here from a more regulatory standpoint. So I think we already covered this with Bob, but the Erickson Power Station is a coal-fired power plant that operated from 1973 to 2022. The reason that we're here today, the reason that this investigation started essentially is because the impoundments, the coal ash impoundments, were required to be licensed by the state of Michigan by December 28th of 2020. That was due to changes in state and federal law. So they applied for a license application to operate the impoundments, and ultimately EGLE denied the license application to operate the impoundments. And a couple reasons for that are because they did not meet what we call groundwater isolation distance. So the distance between the bottom of the impoundment and the top of the groundwater, there needs to be a minimum distance there, and they didn't meet that. The groundwater is too close to the bottom of the impoundments. And also the liner type, the material they used for the liners of the impoundments were not up to the regulations. So EGLE denied their license application because of those reasons. But part of that license application process, part of the requirements, was that they had to install a groundwater monitoring network. That's a requirement of the state law and the federal law. And when they did that, they pretty much right away found that they had groundwater contamination when they started sampling these monitor wells that they installed. So when EGLE denied their operating license application, they were supposed to cease operation. They were supposed to cease operating the impoundments, cease accepting waste there. They couldn't do that without shutting the power plant down entirely. But ultimately, on November 27th, 2022, they did generate their last megawatt of power for coal power in the city of Lansing, and they shut down their plant. They stopped operating the impoundments, and they began working on a closure plan to close the impoundments. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that entails and what we consider closed when it comes to these impoundments. So this is a kind of picture of what's going on with the impoundment closure here. In January of 2023, EGLE approved their closure plan for the impoundments. So they had to submit a work plan to us to show how they were going to close the impoundments, and we had to approve that. Later on in September of 2023, we approved an update or a memo that went over how they were going to verify that they had closed the impoundments. So the type of closure that they're doing here, when we say closure, what they had to do is remove all the coal ash and any soil that was impacted from contamination from the coal ash. So they also had to remove the liner material that was present in the impoundments. And in the impoundments where there was no liner, they over excavated an additional 1 foot. So in order to demonstrate that they actually have done that and removed all the coal ash, they have several different lines of evidence. So one of them is they know the elevations of the bottom of the impoundments from the original design, so they have verification just by elevation. They have verification by visual looking. You can see this top picture here. Coal ash is very black. It's very obvious here, and this is a picture from when the coal ash had been removed, so that's kind of the natural color of the soil. So that's one of their lines, is just a visual. Another one of their lines of evidence is analytical. So they're going to actually go in and grid out these impoundments and take samples, and they're going to compare what they see in the coal ash or in the soil to what was in the coal ash. And then finally, they have a microscopy or microscopic verification method where they actually take samples individually and they'll look at them under the microscope to identify any coal ash that might be left behind. So it's pretty robust lines of evidence to make sure that they've got all that coal ash out and any contaminated soil that might be left behind. So the good news is, as I think we're sitting here right now, as far as we know, all the coal ash and impacted soils have been removed from the impoundments. So that means they have removed the source of contamination from the impoundments, which is a very positive thing. I think we're still awaiting the verification report, so they have to do these verification methods, and they have to send us a report that we review. We'll ultimately approve that report or deny it based on what is in it. But one more important thing to consider with respect to the groundwater contamination is that EGLE, the state of Michigan, will not consider the impoundments actually closed until they submit an approved remedial action plan. So the remedial action plan is because they have groundwater contamination. So that plan is going to address how they're going to clean up the groundwater, and I'm going to go over some of the specifics of what a remedial action plan is. But that's very important, is that we will not consider the impoundments closed until we have that remedial action plan. I know just from talking to them, source removal is going to be a big element of that remedial action plan. That's always really good when we get remedial action plans where they're going to actually completely remove the source of that contamination. And all of that contaminated ash and liner and soil has been sent to a licensed landfill. So this is kind of why we're all here, talking about the groundwater contamination and the remedial action process. So just want to go over that here. I think Bob has done a very good job of giving you some of the background on the types of contamination that they found, but just to recap, what they found when they installed their initial monitor wells was that they had contamination consisting of boron, lithium, molybdenum, sulfate, and total dissolved solids. I didn't put calcium on there, but calcium is another thing that's elevated that is an indicator of coal ash. So that's why we're here, is that they found that contamination in their groundwater. So because they found that contamination, they have to submit to us a remedial investigation report and a remedial action plan. So what remedial investigation report, remedial action plan consists of is a full delineation of the contamination. So what I mean by that is the vertical extent of the contamination, as in how deep does it go into the ground? Is it just in that shallow glacial aquifer? Is it getting into the deep bedrock aquifer? So we need that vertical delineation. And we also need horizontal delineation, and then how far has this contamination plume traveled? Another thing they have to do, which is very important to everybody here, is to evaluate any and all what we call exposure pathways. So that's looking at, is there any potential for this contamination to get into a residential drinking water? Is it getting into surface water where it could interact with fish and accumulate in fish, and then people can eat the fish? Or any other environmental exposure pathways that we can think of. All those exposure pathways have to be analyzed and accounted for in a remedial action plan, and then they have to control or mitigate those exposure pathways to make sure that they're not completed with a person interacting with that contamination. So again, they have to submit that remedial action plan to the state. It's not a voluntary thing. It has to be submitted to us, and it has to be approved by us. And it's not just me that's approving it. We actually, in Materials Management Division, of the division that I'm in, we have a whole committee of experts that review every remedial action plan we get. It's called our Remediation Advisory Team, or the RAT team. So the remedial action plan has to be reviewed and approved by that team. And also important for people here is that it has to undergo a public comment period, and they have to have a public meeting. So in that public comment period, they're going to present to you the remedy that they have selected to deal with their groundwater contamination. They're going to have to tell why they think it's effective, and they're going to have to tell you why they think that they can actually do it. So that's kind of the general basics of what's required in a remedial investigation and a remedial action plan. it didn't come up, but there's been a lot of talk about this groundwater model that they've presented and showed some figures in, so I figured I'd put a bullet point up there. The groundwater modeling is not a requirement of a remedial action plan. It's a tool that can be used, but it's not a requirement, and so it's not something that they have to do for a remedial action plan. And I have this figure up here, which I realized I didn't talk about, but so this is kind of what I mean when I say delineation. This is kind of an example of where they're at with delineation in that shallow glacial aquifer. So what you're looking at here is a map of the facility. So you can see that's where the impoundments are. That's like Delta here, and we're kind of up here in the nature center. So what you're seeing is the delineation. For the current amount of data that I have, I made this map to show what the current delineation looks like. And basically what you're seeing is, this is for boron. They have to do this delineation for every chemical that they find that's above our criteria. So this one specifically is for boron, but they'd have to do this for everything. And what you're looking at is the boron concentration here. It's, as it increases, it's getting into these yellows and oranges and reds, and then the lower end, it's the blue. So you can see what I did here is I put a red line. That red line represents our cleanup criteria. And in the shallow aquifer, what we have for the cleanup criteria is 0.5 milligrams per liter. And I'll get into that a little bit later on what that number represents. But suffice it to say, this line, to be fully delineated in that upper aquifer, this line has to form a closed circle. And you can see it's not doing that right now. So they have not fully delineated the contamination plume in the upper aquifer. They have not done it in the bedrock aquifer either. So that's kind of what we mean when we say delineation. That's an example of one, like a map that can show delineation. All right, so moving on to the remedial investigation process. That's essentially the step in the process that they're in right now. They are working on their remedial investigation. We also call it in our solid waste program assessment monitoring, where they have to go through these steps to delineate the plume. So this, I think Bob showed probably the same map. This is the current state of what it looks like here. Again, these are the impoundments. Each of these dots represents a monitor well that has been installed. So when we first started, when they first installed their monitoring network, they had 6 wells, and they're up to 28 wells now. And most of them are on their property, but they have installed some wells here off their property too. There are some things that are holding up progress on installing the wells in the places that they absolutely need to go to kind of chase that plume, as Bob talked about. So one of the things that they've done now is submitted a permit application to install wells here. You can see the groundwater flow direction with this arrow. The next step is they need to get somewhere in this region to start delineating in that area. That requires, because it's in a regulated wetland, that requires that they get an approved permit to install a well and to drill a well into that wetland. So wetlands are really sensitive areas that need to be protected. So they have done that, and that permit is under review in our Water Resources Division. The other thing that's slowing delineation down is that this property owner up here has completely denied access for them to get onto their property to drill a well down gradient. So that's holding up the process also. So again, the plume is not fully delineated, but they are chasing the plume by installing additional wells as needed. So that's kind of a really brief overview of where they're at in their remedial action or remedial investigation process. So I also do want to go over, again, what everybody's here for is a little bit of the details of the private well sampling. So kind of summarize where they are with the private well sampling, what's been done. So far, I think the number is, from what I can see in the data, is that they sampled 52 private wells. This map kind of shows the distribution of them. And they found that some of those wells have elevated concentrations of parameters that are commonly associated with coal ash, and that they do have on their property from the impoundment. So again, boron and lithium are the most notable contaminants and the highest concentrations that they found. But they did also find sulfate and total dissolved solids in some of the wells, though it wasn't as common. So we've talked a lot about criteria and numbers, maximum contaminant levels. We've had a lot of different numbers thrown around about them. The numbers that I have up here are the most recent ones that I could find from the EPA maximum contaminant levels published in 2018. And what I found is that boron and lithium, total dissolved solid and sulfate do not have a maximum contaminant level as regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. The Safe Drinking Water Act is the act that the EPA uses to regulate drinking water. So none of those contaminants actually have an MCL. Again, that does not mean that they're something that you should drink and that they're safe, but they don't have a legally enforceable maximum contaminant level. Some of them do have what was talked about, health advisory criteria, and the ones in that EPA 2018 MCL documents say for adults, the lifetime health advisory is 6 milligrams per liter. For children, 10 kilograms or under, that's 22 pounds. It would be 3 milligrams per liter. So again, we've seen some different numbers thrown around, and that depends on when you're looking at the numbers. This was the most recent ones that I could find. I'm not a toxicologist, I'm a geologist, so this is kind of most of what I would say about these criteria. At the end, I am going to put contact information for our toxicologist from, we work with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. So they'll be able to tell you a lot more about what they think of the criteria and what the current science tells them. So feel free to contact our toxicologist when I put that info up there. So some of the numbers that we're using to delineate, like that last number I showed on the previous slide, this slide, was 0.5 milligrams per liter. That's a lot lower than the health advisory criteria. So the reason that we're using that for our cleanup criteria in that Part 201 document that Bob alluded to is that it's based on a toxicity to certain plants. So we call it phytotoxicity. So at 0.5 milligrams per liter, boron can start being toxic to certain plants. So it'll be a concern for irrigating crops of certain types. So that's what our cleanup criteria is based on for boron, 0.5. We do have a residential well criteria also for lithium, but it's at 0.17 milligrams per liter, and I don't think any of your wells exceeded 0.17 milligrams per liter. There are various advisories about it, and the coal ash rule that we used for delineation of lithium is 0.4 milligrams per liter. And you heard Roma allude to that number also, so that's the criteria we use for lithium. And our Michigan Department of Health and Human Services does recommend alternate water if you are exceeding 0.04 milligrams per liter in lithium. Okay, so again, thanks to Bob for doing a really good primer of this, but this is kind of one of the things that's been talked about a lot with this is how do we know what's naturally occurring and what is contamination? All those contaminants that I talked about there are naturally occurring. They form, they make up various parts of the Earth's crust in some abundance. So we're in a situation here where we have these contaminants in residential wells, and we have them on the property as contaminants from coal ash, and we need to be able to figure out if it's naturally occurring or not. So this slide shows some of the methods that we can use to make that determination. The biggest one that we talked about with using site-specific data was that background determination. So what's naturally occurring in the background. So how we do that, as Bob alluded to, is installing wells in the up gradient direction. And I'll just kind of recap that in the hydrogeology lesson. The best way to think about this to me is, Bob used the gold analogy. Since we're talking about contamination, though, you kind of think of it as if there's a factory that's on a river, and that factory is pumping contamination into the river, and you want to know what the chemical makeup of the river is that's not being impacted by the factory. You go upstream of the factory and you grab a sample, and you look at the chemistry of that sample, and when you find what the chemistry is, you can say, okay, well, this is the chemistry that has not been impacted by the factory. So it's similar with groundwater. It's a lot more complicated than a linear stream flow. The groundwater does flow, and instead of upstream, downstream, we use the terms up gradient and down gradient. So that's one of the major lines of evidence, and that's kind of what this map is showing. Bob showed how complicated some of the groundwater flow directions can be at this site. But this is showing one of the upgradient wells that was sampled as Monterey Well 12B. See, this line is showing, this is from the most recent groundwater monitoring report. So this line is showing groundwater flow direction, and this well is in that upstream direction. And when you look at that well, it does have elevated boron and lithium. The other really important thing with background is that we have these background wells in the correct formations. So if we're interested in what's going on in the deep bedrock aquifer, we have to make very sure that our background well is also in that same aquifer. And we're going to have a background determined for the deep aquifer, the Saginaw Formation. And we're going to have a different background for the shallow glacial aquifer. So all that has to be done. And they have determined background in some of these monitoring boards. They have numbers for background. I think of these background numbers in investigations like this. It's kind of like a living thing. We update the background as we get more data. So those background numbers are not set in stone. As we find out more things about groundwater flow directions and install new wells, the background numbers can change at this point. So that's one of the biggest ones is making sure we have a handle on background. Some of the other ways that we can look at what's naturally occurring and what's not naturally occurring is we can kind of zoom out and look at, we talked about the Saginaw aquifer, so we can look at all the data we can find from the Saginaw aquifer and see, are we seeing any similar patterns in the Saginaw aquifer in terms of chemical composition. If I look at all the data from the Saginaw aquifer and I can't find any other place that has elevated boron, I'm going to scratch my head and say, okay, something is weird going on here on site with Erickson, and it's probably not naturally occurring widespread in the Saginaw aquifer because we don't see it anywhere else. So we're going to look at, different materials in the Saginaw aquifer, the lithology, geology, things like that. So some of the other things we can do are what we call geochemical fingerprinting. So that's getting into geochemistry. There's a lot more different types of this, but some of the ones that we can use are multivariate statistics. That's going to be not just looking at one or two contaminants at one time or individually, but we're going to combine them all and look at the big picture all at the same time. So we can do that. One of the things that has also been done is what we call isotope geochemistry. This is getting into the weeds when we talk about isotopes. But this is something we talked about with Board Water and Light, and they have done some isotope testing. I've got a ton of questions for them on that, and that's a whole other story. But an isotope is essentially a specific different species of an element. So we talk about boron, it's a single element, right? But it turns out that there's actually various different types of boron, and the types of boron that we see in an environmental sample are determined by the source of that sample. So there has been a lot of research into isotope geochemistry and coal ash, and that can be used as a determination of what's impacted by coal ash and what isn't. So again, I want to make sure that I drive this home that there has not been a final determination on whether or not what we're seeing in your wells is naturally occurring or not. So I'm not going to talk about all of the nitty-gritty details of every single line of evidence there that's being looked at, but I did want to kind of do this, zoom out and look at the general characteristics of the Saginaw aquifer. This is the aquifer that your drinking water wells are in. So I kind of want to dive into that aquifer and look at all the data I could possibly find in the Saginaw aquifer and see if we can come up with some kind of patterns to characterize what we're seeing. So a general overview of the Saginaw aquifer. This map shows the extent of it. So it's a very, very large aquifer in mid-Michigan. It is our primary drinking water source in the mid-Michigan area, in the Tri-County area, that is. When you get into some other portions of it in the north, it can start getting salty or briny, and it's not a very good drinking water source. But in our area in Lansing, it is our main drinking water source. So what it's made of geologically, it's made of the Saginaw Formation, we call it. So it's made of sandstone, mostly. That's probably the most common rock type. Shale, siltstone, and it also actually has, surprisingly, minor amounts of coal and limestone. So that could be important when we're looking at coal ash, and there's coal in the formation too. But we don't have enough information at this point to know. What the Saginaw Formation actually represents geologically is a shallow sea that covered the middle of Michigan over 300 million years ago. So very, very different geologic setting than we are in now. It's a shallow kind of subtropical sea, and it's depositing these sands and clays and silts that are now making up the Saginaw aquifer. So when I started looking into the Saginaw aquifer, I wanted to know about the geochemistry of it. I was very pleased to find that we have a very robust data set on the geochemistry in the Saginaw aquifer very close to here in Ingham County. We don't have this for all the counties that the Saginaw aquifer is in, but Ingham County does have a lot of data. And I was able to get a data set that had over 2,000 data points from the Saginaw from 1980 to 2020, and I looked at that as closely as I could. Boron is one of the analytes that is represented in that data set. But lithium is not. Some of the other parameters we've talked about, sulfates in there. There is some data for total dissolved solids and various other geochemical parameters. But I'm going to look at boron here because it's one of the hot topics and most common ones that we're seeing in the wells. So this is a map showing the distribution of the boron in the Saginaw aquifer in Ingham County, in that Ingham County data set. So what you can see here, this map basically to orient ourselves, this is pretty much all of Ingham County. Lansing is up here. You can't really see it very well on this, but this is 127 going north-south, and I think this is 96 here. So we're not on this map here at the Nature Center. We're kind of off to the side down here. So this doesn't contain the very specific site that we're on right now, but it does contain a wealth of data for the Saginaw aquifer. So what we see in this map, again, the color is color-coded, kind of like that delineation map I showed. What we see here is that there are actually large portions of the Saginaw aquifer that have elevated boron. It's not uncommon to see elevated boron in the Saginaw aquifer at large. So this is our kind of scale down here. From the blues would be 0 or non-detect, and all the way up to 6 milligrams per liter at the highest. So what we see is this big splotch of these bright colors showing where the elevated boron is in Saginaw. You can see we kind of concentrate around this Williamston area. So the question now becomes is, what is the cause of that elevated boron? Can we find any kind of patterns in the geology that can tell us why there's elevated boron in the Saginaw Formation? And then can we correlate that pattern to the wells that we're seeing here that we sampled at Erickson? And when we look at the data, what we see is there is a very, very specific pattern right away. What we notice in the wells that have elevated boron, there are several things that we see. First and foremost, the most obvious thing to the geologist is that when you look at, and I've looked at hundreds of well logs now in Saginaw, when you find a well that has elevated boron, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be completed in that shale material that we talked about. So this is kind of a image showing a typical well that would be drilled into the Saginaw Formation. This is a picture of shale rock. So when we have a well in shale, with the amount of data that I've looked at, I would predict that it has elevated boron in it. And it's not just a shale that we're looking at, there are also other geochemical parameters that we can look at that indicate elevated boron. So this is kind of hard to read down here in small, but this is kind of that geochemical fingerprint I talked about, that other parameters that show up when we have elevated boron. So one of the most strange ones in the Saginaw, especially if you guys have wells, you know about the hardness and dissolved mineral content in your well. One of the things that we see in wells that have high boron in the Saginaw Formation is that they have low hardness, kind of unusual. So unusually low hardness, we have unusually elevated sodium, unusually elevated fluoride, unusually high pH, so that's acidity or alkalinity of the water, and then that goes in hand with the elevated boron. So those geochemical parameters together, in conjunction with being in the shale, are this really, really strong correlation with elevated boron. For wells that don't have elevated boron, we see are usually completed in the sandstone unit. So I'm working on a project right now to try to map out where all the shale is and where all the sandstone is in the Saginaw aquifer and see if it lines up really closely with with the distribution of boron. So now the question becomes is this the geochemical and geological patterns we're seeing in the wells that were sampled here? So are your wells all in shale? Do we see unusually low hardness? Do we see unusually high sodium in these wells? So when we look at that, we do see that same pattern in your wells. So they are mostly, the ones that have elevated boron are in the shale. They have unusually low hardness, pH is elevated. So we are seeing that same geochemical fingerprint, but that does not mean that your wells are not impacted by impoundments at Erickson. That means that there's an explanation for elevated boron, but that's not the whole story. We know there are other contaminants present. What we see, we can't explain elevated sulfate that has shown up in some of these wells. We don't really see elevated sulfate when we look at this Ingham County data set. It's not remarkable. So some wells did have elevated sulfate. That hasn't been explained. We don't know much about lithium because it's something that's really not sampled for that much. But all the research I could do, I looked at many publications and USGS. Shale is also a very well-known source of lithium. But again, we don't have that data, so we need more site-specific data. And again, driving this point home that we have not made that determination as to whether or not this is naturally occurring. This is just one line of evidence of many that are going to have to be used at this site. All right, so summary, what I talked about today. I know I went over a lot of stuff, but essentially the number one accomplishment that has happened recently is that coal ash and coal ash contaminated soils have been completely removed from all the impoundments. The contamination source is gone. We are awaiting the verification report to prove to the state that that has happened. The remedial investigation is ongoing. I think Bob demonstrated very, very well that there's a lot of data gaps, and those gaps are trying to be filled right now. They're drilling new wells, they're stepping out, they're delineating, they're doing some of these more complicated methods like isotope geochemistry that we're talking about. So as that's ongoing, when they finalize that and submit a remedial investigation report, they have to submit that remedial action plan to us. I will review it first and then bring it to our remediation advisory committee. That's, again, a whole panel of experts. I think we probably have over 100 years of experience combined on that RAT team. And again, for you guys, I'm sure everybody here will be interested in this, when they do submit that remedial action plan and choose a remedy to address this contamination, it has to go through a public comment period by statute. And we have to have a public meeting, so similar meeting to this one. The final thing that I haven't talked about, hasn't been talked about at all yet, is that EGLE, the state of Michigan, is pursuing enforcement action against Board of Water and Light to hold them accountable for this contamination. And that enforcement action will be memorialized in what we call an administrative consent order, and that'll lay out everything they need to do and everything, from delineation. It'll talk about the investigation report and all that. So I'm going to let our enforcement coordinator talk about what goes into a typical ACO here, just one slide. And again, this has been said multiple times here, but Board of Water and Light, as they are investigating this continuously, they are still providing bottled water to people as far as I know, and they are still offering testing to people. So this last slide, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Willard, who's our enforcement coordinator on this case.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm hearing a lot of technical information, and what I really need to know is what's the bottom line. Should we be drinking bottled water or continue using our well water? So what I hear you saying is that you found contaminants in our well.
Yeah.
But you don't know whether this is natural occurrence or.
Yeah, and I'm sure that doesn't matter to you because
Okay.
it doesn't make a difference if it's if it's bad, you don't want to drink it.
So what is your recommendation for those of us in this community?
Yeah, I'm again not a toxicologist, so I can't speak to specific recommendations. I will at the end put our number for our state of Michigan toxicologist who is an expert on this stuff. Those health advisory criteria that I talked about, that's what the EPA would recommend. But again, I'm not a toxicologist, so I can't really say too much more about that. other than following those criteria.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Can we answer?
Yeah, so and this last slide here, Lisa Fisher here is our toxicologist, she knows about this site. She will give you an answer on what our Michigan Department of Health and Human Services would recommend with the specific results of your well. You can also reach out to your local health department, I'll have their contact information, the Barry Health Accountant Department knows about the site too, and they can provide education. I'm sorry that I'm not a toxicologist here.
and so should we be writing that down?
If you want to talk to a toxicologist about specifics of your well,
There is a number you can call at the Board of Water and Light to get water delivered.
So it's on the bottom of the sheet that you got when we went around the neighborhood, so you can call and get bottled water from.
Can I ask a question?
yeah.
Probably, see, I'm a civil engineer for a long time, and most of civil engineers have standards that they can't go below that, or, you know what I'm talking about? And I don't see no actual standard. If the standard we're dealing with now is 40 years old, then we need to get our act together, because this is Michigan, we have a lot of water around here.
Right.
And we need to make sure everyone knows the standards for having boron in your water. Or can we clean up our well without having to deal with, Board and Water Light telling us that our water is all right?
Yeah, I mean, if it's naturally occurring, it's.
Well, what I mean-
I can be able to, but I
I
understand.
mean, I live way up north,
Yeah.
and we never had this problem. Cause my dad ran a farm with beef cattle, and we never had any animals get sick or anything, and we used to test our water, but we didn't let the state do it, we did it by our own.
Okay.
So that's the only thing I see, is the standards are not there.
We do have standards, that's, we have to call it Part 201,
Well, I mean,
standards, and
who knows these standards? You guys keep them, the public doesn't know the standards. But, I didn't know about, I quit drinking this water 10 years ago, because I just didn't like the smell. So I'm drinking bottled water most of my, for 10 years, so. I'm not surprised by this, but, I'm just saying, people need to know this.
Yeah, I agree, I think.
I mean, it isn't your fault, I mean.
The standards that we
The
use.
state's been screwing up for
Yeah,
50 years about this.
yeah, I mean, the standards that we use, we always try to be as up to date as possible with the legislation that we can be with the science that informs what's healthy and what's not. So there are mechanisms to revise standards as we get more information, but it's a process, and, even EPA has not really done a full analysis of what boron does. They have these health advisories, the boron lithium.
Yeah, this is,
But,
I mean, we're not the only county that has coal plants around here, so
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know if you guys
No.
are keeping an eye on the other ones.
So why can't we turn it, the municipal system, just hook up the Board of Water, Light Water, so we don't have to deal with this while they're working it correctly?
Well, you
Throw a
don't-
comment onto your question, and I'll take a shot at that if you don't mind.
yeah,
So one of the things that happens is the standards you're talking about, I'm assuming you own your own private domestic well, you're not hooked up to
Yeah.
the Board of Water and Light system. So those standards that are established by EPA refer to water systems.
Yeah.
They can't come in and tell you your boron is
Well,
100,000
I've
parts
done
per million,
one
you can't
thing.
use it.
I used to live in Lansing, and I have sensitive skin, and that's one of the reasons I moved out here.
Okay, so
Because
what
my
am I?
skin would, I had breakouts all the time.
Yeah, my point would be, we could change those standards you're talking about, but nobody can enforce them on your personal well. We could drop it to point zillion,
Well,
million,
it's
zillion.
good to know the standards.
No, it is, and those standards are published, we don't hide them.
Well, I don't see them
But-
anywhere.
Right.
When
If you
Board
contact
of Water
Board of
sent me
Water
a
Light-
thing, they didn't send me, this is the standard of what your
Right,
water
because
should
you're
be.
not.
yeah, and part of that is
not on
because,
their water
yeah, the
system,
specific
so-
contaminants too don't have those maximum contaminant
It's
levels.
like some kind of secret between, people. that
Yeah,
drink
and
the
I know
water.
it appears that
They
way.
don't want you to have the information.
So, I mean, should I jump in here for a second? Can we let them finish? Got one more guy that I want to
Yeah,
get
I
on,
know.
and then we'll open it up.
They will all be
And I'm happy to
available
stick
for
around, I have
questions?
cards for those who
Excuse me,
don't.
they will all
write
be
it down.
available for questions? All
Yes,
the
yes,
speakers?
all of them, yes.
All right. Fine enough.
Yeah, so we can,
Alright, Dave, if you wanna do your,
if you wanna just back up quickly,
yeah.
Evan already talked about the licensing denial letter that was issued in 2021, which is one of the things that triggered our enforcement action, and the big reason why I'm here specifically actually is the enforcement partners to ask questions, and I'm happy to stick around outside, take us out of the room. I've got cards for people who don't have stuff written down, I get the cards, I can let you touch any of the people that are on Evan's slide, but I'm happy to talk about it. So, the second bullet point down, the goal of the administrative consent order, for short we call them ACOs, is to make sure that we get the Board of Light and Water back in compliance with all these standards we're talking about. All right, they have to clean up the groundwater contamination. Half that order is related to them not being licensed. That doesn't affect you guys in water. The part that affects it is the remedial action plan that I was talking about. That will be memorialized in the ACO, which means they can't just say, we started it and we don't want to finish it. They can't get away with that. This will hold their hand in the candle, so to speak, because the Attorney General will be signing off this. It's going to be a legal agreement with them. Once they're in on it and they've signed on the dotted line, they have to do what's in there. If not, there's financial penalties that can be assessed to them later. And a big part of this is the third bullet, again, this compliance program. Part of that is the wrap that Evan's talking about. It doesn't necessarily have to wait till the order's done. The wrap is something that's gonna evolve over time. Like you mentioned, there's gonna be a public comment period. That's when you guys can show up and ask more questions. These guys, great question back here, why don't we just hook up to their system? Maybe that's an option they look at some point. They may say, we'll put everybody in the water system. I don't know. We can't speak for Board of Water and Light. And then, if they don't wanna sign the ACO, which I'm 99% confident to say that they're gonna sign the ACO we present them with, which will probably be in early 2024, because they came to us and asked for it. They came in and said, we know we violated the law. We need to get ahead of this and work this out with you guys, and that went back to the licensing decision and our technical folks, the geologists saying, all right, we gotta figure out what the problem is. Bob pointed out, you gotta get a lot of data to figure out the problem. If you don't have the problem, you can't get a solution, but we can get them into that agreement, and that can put them down the road to getting this cleaned up. And I realize there's probably a zillion questions you have, and I know we have one more speaker to go that we need to get, and we're basically out of time here, so I'm gonna shut up, but I'm gonna stick around. I've got cards, I'll hang out up front. If we need to clear the room out, whatever you guys want, we're here to answer questions.